Jackson. Welcome back to The Great Divide, a YouTube vlog about the disunited states of America. With us today, we are very happy and proud and excited to have Kathy Kelly, formerly of Voices in the Wilderness, which is now Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and a truly amazing organization waging peace all around the world. Kathy herself has been nominated for Nobel Peace Prize twice in the past, and the organization that I mentioned, Voices in the Wilderness, itself was nominated one year. She's done a tremendous amount of peace work, both abroad and then bringing it back to the United States to talk with people about her witness and share the stories of many, many individuals in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other places as well. So welcome to The Great Divide, Kathy.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's good to be in an interview with you again.
So I know that you have been keeping a very close eye on what's going on in Yemen for quite some time now. Can you kind of, I think that there's probably a lot of people who maybe they rely a little bit on, mainstreamy kind of media, and they may not have even heard about what's going on in Yemen, or maybe they haven't heard about the U.S. connection to that. So, fill us in.
Well, Tom, I surely had a great deal in common with people who had thought very little about Yemen up until, I suppose, about maybe 2 years ago in May, 2 years to the previous May. And I mentioned that time because President Trump had given his first address to both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House. And I had thought, well, I never watched television, but I should watch this. I should, get more familiar with what is this new president saying. It wasn't even called the State of the Union because he hadn't been in office long enough to give a State of the Union. And I was just stunned because he did what presidents often do. He invited someone to be part of the gallery, the audience for the talk, whose story would so emotionally grab people that it would help to kind of advance something the president wanted to say. Well, in the audience was the widow of Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen, a Navy SEAL who had just, I think, weeks before been killed. And so there was a standing ovation for the widow, and it was 4 minutes long. Thunderous applause, and then the cameras, of course, were focused in on her, and she's trying to maintain her composure. And President Trump was speaking over the applause, saying, he'll always be remembered. He's in heaven. He's looking down at you. And it was a very emotional moment, but at no point in that presentation did anyone ever hear where Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen had been killed, and it was in Yemen. And so as I started to try and figure that out a little bit more, I realized that so much of it was achingly, terribly familiar. Yemen is the poorest country on the Arab Peninsula, one of the poorest countries in the world. It wasn't always that way, but it is now. And the Navy SEALs had been assigned to go to Yemen for what was called a night raid, similar to ones that we've learned about in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And they're very professionally trained at this. And in a night raid, the helicopter lands, the Navy SEALs burst out. They have done this many, many times. They go into a home where they're to capture someone. In this case, it was one of the heads of what's called Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And they, if need be, hog-tie the owner and the oldest people within the home. They lock the women up in one corner. They ransack the house. They take cell phones and any other equipment, and then they go. But in this case, the kinspeople came running, even though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and they quickly disabled the helicopter. So a battle ensued, a gun battle, and probably the death of Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen was caused by a grenade, possibly one that had been thrown by a teenager. It seems uncertain. But in the course of that evening, when the Navy SEALs had called in air support, a helicopter gunship came in and missiles started raining down on the little mud huts in this village. And Fahim Mohsen, a young woman 30 years in age, was in a hut with 12 children, her children and her sister's children, and a missile tore through this hut. And so Fahim has to decide, does she take everybody out into the darkness? There's no electricity, or do they stay and wait? And she chose the former. And as soon as she emerged, maybe it was the heat from her body that activated a sensor. She had her newborn cradled in one arm. She was holding her 5-year-old by the hand. Immediately, a bullet killed her, went right into the back of her head. This was the testimony from her 5-year-old child. Miraculously, the 5-year-old and the infant survived. That night, 10 children under 13 years of age were killed. 6 mothers were killed. 26 Yemenis had been killed. But the only person that anyone would ever hear about in the United States mainstream media was Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen, and they didn't even know where he'd been killed. He was killed in the remote village of Al Hayal in Yemen. Now, the United States is not technically at war against Yemen, but every single day, in addition to United States attacks, the United States is supporting in very, very concrete ways the country of Saudi Arabia, one of the most opulent, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, to bludgeon, to pound on Yemenis, not only with bombings that occur on an average of 3 times a day, but also with a state of siege. And this is why I mentioned familiarity, because you and I, Tom, know in a way that many would never know what it was like for Iraqi children to be among those who were nearing death, and 500,000 children, according to the United Nations, when we started going over there, 500,000 children under age 5 had already succumbed to the brutal and the lethal effect of economic sanctions. So Yemen is under siege. And because of that siege, goods aren't going that are desperately needed. It's a country that's experiencing drought and near famine conditions. People need water, they need food, they need fuel. The prices go up, up, up because of the siege of the major port that is the way through which food and water would come. And so the United Nations, they're sounding the alarm. They're telling people it could be that by the end of this year, 18 million people could die in Yemen. And the numbers of children who are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, you never ever recover from that, are staggeringly high. 1 million people afflicted by cholera. It's such a cruel situation. And why ever in the world would the United States be supporting the Saudi-led coalition in this case? Well, this is at least finally being addressed by CNN, which is kind of amazing, by the Congress. A bill was just introduced to the Congress 2 days ago by Ro Khanna of California to say we have to stop being the enablers, the supporters, the weapon sellers in this situation. There's a journalist named Samuel Oakford, very much an alternative journalist, and he likened the situation to a drive-by. Tom, you lived in Uptown where I now live, and drive-bys were all too familiar. And he said, it's as though the Saudis are driving the car, but the United States supplies the vehicle, the fuel, the surveillance as to what the target ought to be, and the cover in case anybody ever might accuse some wrongdoing of having been done. It's a terrible, terrible blight on the record of human rights in terms of human rights abuses for every country involved. But the United States is definitely one of the warring parties in Yemen.
A more recent story that did get some coverage is the one about the school bus in Yemen that was attacked. Apparently it was a Saudi attack, but using American-made weapons. Is that accurate?
It was a Lockheed Martin 500-pound bomb that had been sold to the Saudis. And You know, at first the Saudis said, no, 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 that was a legitimate target, but then they had to backtrack away from that. Those kids were on their grade school field trip. They had for the summer gone to study religious texts, and this was their reward. They'd each been issued a bright blue UNICEF book bag. And those are so special because actually it costs $70 to equip a child with the book bag if they get the most inexpensive kind. And that's because inside are vaccines and needed vitamins and antibiotics, things like that. So they're very, very, very important book bags. And those kids must have been so proud and so happy. And the direct attack on that school bus instantly killed. I mean, we now have the names and the ages and the place of residence for 34 children, and their teachers, another 56, I believe, were wounded. And, you know, I remember, Tom, you went with emergency medical technicians from 9/11 who had been called to that scene over to Afghanistan. And so we have to think, you know, what does it mean for those EMTs who risk their lives? Because with the double tap, once people show up to perform rescue, they're then sometimes the hit of a second attack. And also, you know, people say, well, you know, you really ought to get the numbers straight. How many people were killed that day of that attack? And it's so macabre and grisly to explain to people, well, when the EMT workers are assembling, excuse me, the body parts, it's very hard to know how many bodies they've really assembled. So other people are now setting up the book bags. In Chicago, we set up the 34 book bags. We bought them from Dollar Days and we set them up in the Federal Building Plaza. And because CNN had covered it just the day before, Chicagoans who don't always stop no matter what display is going on, because there's so much, you know, they were stopping and pausing in the Federal Building Plaza and saying, I heard about that. Now, that was not true with regard to Iraq. You never, ever saw the mainstream media covering what happened in Iraq. In fact, Stephen Kinzer was the only one who got an article into the New York Times, and that was after we had met with him in Baghdad and kind of begged him, please, please go to a hospital. And he went off to Babylon and went to a hospital there because it was just so hard to be known amongst the media people as somebody who would cover the hospitals. People were NPR told us, no, we're not going to be the dupes of Saddam Hussein and go into those hospitals. Is there somehow all of these children suffering death by asphyxiation through hunger in their mother's arms, cross-legged on the beds the mothers sat holding the infants, was staged so that people would think ill of Saddam Hussein. Well, you know, Saddam Hussein was already demonized as the only person living in Iraq. So there's a bit of a difference, I would say, with regard to Yemen. And I think that's why, at this point, Steny Hoyer, the Democrat House whip, more or less, the person of most stature, he gets a load of money from a lot of weapon-making companies. He doesn't need it to get reelected, but Steny Hoyer disperses it to various other elected representatives all across the country. That's kind of how the game works. And then they all sort of agree, okay, you know, we're not going to upset the apple cart. We're not going to get in the way of the profit-making for General Dynamics and Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. But now I think they've said, you know what? There's too much attention right now to what's been done in Yemen. So I think Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman must be getting a message. He's the head of the war, more or less. He has orchestrated that war as the Saudi Crown Prince. He has said to the people of Saudi Arabia, he said it on television, in a televised speech in the spring of 2017, he said, a long war is in our favor. A protracted war is in our interests. But I wonder if he might start to change his mind. And I'm sure when he came over to the United States and there was a royal roadshow rolled out for him, every living former president met with him. Oprah Winfrey met with him. People in Hollywood couldn't wait to meet with him because he's opening up movie theaters in Saudi Arabia. And they're not always doing so well these days in the United States. So it was, you know, every profit-making entity wanted to meet with the person who had supposedly royal blood. it's kind of ironic because we live in a country where supposedly we were founded because people rejected the idea of there even being such a thing as royal blood. But he came over with barely a hint of criticism, really. But
Yeah.
now it's changing, and so I think we certainly owe it to people in Yemen to do everything we can to prevent the United States from continued weapon sales, continued participation in the bombing, continued surveillance assistance, and also continued cover at the United Nations. So November 6th, 7th, and 8th, a number of us will go to the Saudi mission to the UN with the backpacks, to the UAE mission to the UN with the backpacks, to the US mission to the UN with the backpacks, and we'll vigil November 6th, 7th, and 8th, and try to do the kind of thing that we feel we can and should do to express nonviolent resistance to these policies.
So I'm wondering if you have gotten a sense of, I had heard that quote from the Prince of Saudi Arabia about a protracted war in Yemen being in Saudi's favor, but that doesn't really get at what's behind that. What is the why of the whole thing? And I think it's fairly obvious why the United States would back Saudi in something like that, just because we're so connected with them. It's been the biggest source of oil on the planet for decades now, et cetera, et cetera. But why does he think that a protracted war in Yemen, of all places, this sort of beleaguered, beaten down populace, what's up with that? Any sense of that?
Tom, I think it's a land grab. I know that it's tricky to talk about peak oil because those kinds of things are certainly difficult to predict. But clearly, the Crown Prince is convinced that he needs to reshape the economy, that there's a chance that they're not going to have an endless supply of their own oil to maintain the lifestyles that this very opulent family has been accustomed to and keep the country going as well. And so there's Yemen, as you said, a beleaguered, beaten, battered country. And I think, the United States in our history had that notion of manifest destiny. Like, of course, all the land that we grabbed from people we could beat, people who once had Mexico and, am I right? Colorado, Utah, California, parts of New Mexico, we took it. And I think the Saudis think, well, why should the Yemenis have that? Here we are with superior technology and development, and we need their natural gas, and we need their oil. And apparently Yemen has quite a lot of reserves. And so Professor Issa Bloomy is a very, very careful scholar. He works in Stockholm, and he has written a book called Destroying Yemen. And that's his contention, that the Saudis want to take the resources. And so it's for profit, and it's also maybe somewhat fed, I know it sounds bizarre, but by not exactly Saudi desperation, but Saudi anxiety, that they wouldn't be able to maintain given their own declining, the ice cube does melt, declining resources. And so the cruelty of it is all the more stunning. There they are drafting, conscripting, no, I shouldn't say that. They're taking mercenaries from Africa, where people are also fleeing famine and wars and drought. And they're saying, sure, we'll give you some money, just come over here and fight these battles for us. They're taking, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis don't have their own people on the ground so much. They have their coordinators coming from the United States and Australia, coordinating special operations, coordinating battles. And even as we speak right now, the port of Hodeidah, this vital, vital port, was not under air attack. There was a suspension of that, but all that while these fighters were going up the coast so they could sort of surround Hodeidah. Well, you close down that port, and if the prices go up any further than they already have, the UN is predicting millions and millions of people who will be unable to survive. And then people start to, their flocks thirst to death and die, or their well dries up and they don't have any irrigation. They can't raise any even subsistence crops. They come to the already overcrowded cities. And what was one of the first places the Saudis bombed, the sewage and sanitation facility in Sana'a, a major, major city. And then they bombed the electrical facility. And we've seen that playbook before in Iraq. You wipe out the electrical facility. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's happening. And, you know, the Saudis have even said when they've been told you can't bomb civilians, they bombed 4 Doctors Without Borders hospitals. 4 of them. But the first time they did it, Ban Ki-moon was then the Secretary of State at the UN, and he said, you know, you can't be bombing hospitals. And I think very tongue-in-cheek, the brigadier general who had to answer as a Saudi military official, I believe his name was Azeri, he said, well, we'll ask our American counterparts for better advice about targeting. Now that was October 27th, 2016. On October 4th, 2016, the United States had just bombed a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan. And when I say bombed, I'm saying that a C-130 transport plane outfitted with Gatling guns and Bofors cannons had flown over the hospital, attacked specifically in this big compound, the emergency room and the intensive care unit. And then in 15-minute intervals, even after the hospital officials and the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders officials are notifying NATO, the United States, the United Nations, the Afghan army, you're bombing a hospital in 15-minute intervals for an hour and a half. They flew away and flew back and continued bombing the hospital. The hospital became rubble in terms of those 2 crucial areas, the emergency room, the ICU. And then afterward, the United States sent a tank to go in and roll over the rubble to destroy further evidence. So of course the Saudis get the green light. They say, well, look what the United States did. And who knows about this? You know, I know about it in much more detail, in part because I went to Afghanistan and I always donate blood. I've got O negative blood, and you know, they want that blood at the emergency hospital. And so I asked kind of offhandedly, I heard you help to do surgeries for some of the survivors of the Kunduz hospital when it was bombed in Afghanistan back in October. This was late November, I think. And I said, are there any patients still here? And the doctors, they saw him there with these young Afghan kids, and they said, oh, hello, yeah, please, he's so lonely. Go and visit this young man. And Had Ahmed had been a pharmacist in the Kunduz hospital, young student pharmacist doing his internship, and he was a survivor. And I think he had survivor's guilt. You know, it wasn't easy. He had an internal catheter and IVs, and he was very sallow, and he'd lost loads of weight and could only walk with assistance, but he would survive. That day, 43 people were killed. 12 of them were his co-workers. 3 were doctors. And after he told me this hair-raising story of, running and getting hit by shrapnel and, the not knowing what in the world this nightmare scene was all about, and trying to dismantle his cell phone because the security people said, do that because they know how to target cell phones. And, then how could he call his family? And he managed to get a call out, got the cell phone back together with one arm still functioning. And that's why he was saved. Family members nearby rescued him from a ditch. But his question, obviously I'm not Afghan, right? And he, looked at the kids and looked at me after he, the story they were translating for me. And he said, who's she? And they said, well, she's our friend from the United States. And he asked me, why did your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. And again, Tom, didn't we hear that again and again in Iraq? Why did your people want to do this to us?
Yeah.
We never could really answer that. Why indeed? But I would say that, in 2003, I know this seems like ancient history, but I think the world came very, very, very close to ending a war before it started, because millions of people turned out on the streets, but also because little tiny grassroots groups, you couldn't have been more mom and pop. That was even a euphemism for Voices in the Wilderness in terms of, the spectrum of peace groups. We were dinky. But little groups like that went back and forth to Iraq and came back and said, this is what we've seen and heard. And it was a model that had worked in Central America to some extent. This is what we've seen and heard. Let us be troubled. And that it wasn't because the mainstream media told people about Iraq. I know that,
Yeah.
but people started to get the message. And Tony Blair and George Bush were nervous that if they didn't get this war going, Scott Ritter and the International Atomic Energy Association were saying, well, we've looked, we do not find any evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And then we were saying, yeah, we'll show you where the evidence is in the pediatrics hospitals where these kids are losing their lives. And they have committed no crime. So the world came close. We hadn't yet seen the Arab Spring. But what if those millions had turned out and sat down and said, you know what, we're not getting up, we're not going to work, we're going to bring everything to a screeching halt, boycott, divest, this kind of thing. It's not impossible that at some point people would realize there can be no rational discussion of solving our problems if we don't dismantle the military. $717 billion military budget for 1 year? How can we ever get the genius we need, the hands on deck we need, the funds we need to solve global warming when the military is like, it's what Dr. King said, a demonic suction cup, a vacuum cleaner, takes it all.
Yeah. And of course, that's been, that vacuum cleaner machine has been vacuuming in Afghanistan for 17 years now, almost 17-year anniversary coming up.
It's so, every statistic is kind of mind-boggling, but the Special Inspector General on Afghan reconstruction, there used to be a Special Inspector General on Iraq reconstruction, and those people all kind of moved over to Afghanistan. They find the goods. They are just so detailed in finding out the information about corruption and greed and waste and shoddy construction and people on the take lining their pockets. And they do quadrennial reports, and those go before the Congress. And it's almost as though, I don't know, do people line their bird cages with these things? What happens to those reports? And when you plow through them, you see, oh my word, the healthcare is so disastrous in Afghanistan. And USAID is billing the United States government for healthcare facilities. And, you look through Google spatial imagery, and that's what John Sopko and the CIGAR people have done, Afghan Reconstruction Special Inspector General, and there's nothing there. People are claiming ghost hospitals, ghost health clinics, ghost first aid places. And that adds up. You've got ghost police people, ghost people who, enlist and get the gun and leave. Well, I don't blame anybody in that desperate situation if they think, well, I need to get a little bit of money into my family, and they enlist and they don't show up. But then the numbers of guns that are on the black market, and everybody's armed. And right now, Kabul has become the most dangerous place in Afghanistan and could get even more dangerous. So that's why I'm always even increasingly ever more impressed by the teenagers I've met there. And, they grow into young adults, but like new youngsters come even from the refugee camps and the street kids school, and they say blood doesn't wash away blood, and we know everybody and their brother in our city is trying to figure out how to shoot, but we don't want to do that. We want to be different. And they just have hosted an inter-ethnic, inter-province conference in a country where 21 out of 34 provinces are suffering from drought and people are desperate. And I talked to one young fellow from the Maidan Wardak province, and I asked him, how is your family? And he said, well, they told me that the bombing is so intense, this is the US bombing, that they can't any longer find places to bury the dead. There's not even, places left where you can dig a grave. That's how bombing affects the countryside. Well, certainly people aren't farming, although the opium crop does manage to thrive. And I can't help but think that with all the surveillance the United States has going on over Afghanistan, they kind of know where the refineries are and what the routes are to take the opium crop to the refinery. So that criminal endeavor continues. And all kinds of warlords have kind of made agreements, okay, this is going to keep on going. And the US is just the most well-equipped and the most well-funded of all the warlords in Afghanistan.
Good point. And yes, I wanted to touch on the whole opium issue coming out of there. And of course, that's obviously a big factor, according to a number of things that I've read, and in keeping us there, as well as the strategic positioning of, having a military presence in Afghanistan and various other kinds of resources, rare earth, rare earth metals and things like that, that the U.S. wants and large companies in the U.S. wants. So those three things together are really probably, what's at the foundation of why we're still there after 17 years.
Well, and why it seems like we might still be there, who knows, another 17 years. You look at the situation with North and South Korea, the United States is still in various parts of Europe, NATO keeps on moving closer and closer to Russia. And it's so obvious in Afghanistan. The United States gets those bases rent-free. They are pouring $45 million, I believe, into maintenance of the bases. And that's way, way less than under the Obama years when they went up to 100,000 troops. And believe it or not, it was $2 million per soldier at the height of the drawdown of U.S. troops. On an average, the United States was paying $2 million per year per soldier in Afghanistan. How could that be? Well, it was a very expensive endeavor to break down the camps and some of the bases and ship things back and move soldiers around. And so I remember in the emergency hospital, a nurse, Emmanuel Nanini, had said to me, Kathy, he was being clever. He said, suppose you just send 6 of your troops home early, or 3. He said, say bye-bye to 3 of them. You're giving me this money, $6 million, what I do, And so it's hard to think about, the supplies pouring into the U.S. bases. And one of them is right across the street from a huge, sprawling, utterly squalid refugee camp. And, people are burning tires for fuel. And then you've got every possible amenity comparatively going in to maintain the United States military. Well, why are they staying? Sure, I'm kind of interested. Is Elon Musk going to maybe get one of these batteries going that could maybe get a bus to move, or a truck, or a train, or a plane? Well, that could, help us in terms of how we've drained Mother Earth of the fossil fuels. But where are they going to get the rare earth minerals, the lithium, the copper, under the Hindu Kush Mountains? There are huge speculations of trillions of dollars worth of those materials. So why would the United States say, oh, well, let's let China have control of that. Let's let Russia have control of that. That's not the way the United States plays things. And so I think the U.S. wants to say to China and Russia, we're here. I don't know that it will work. The Chinese are very, very, very ascendant right now. China and Russia have been meeting with the Taliban. I mean, there are all kinds of wheeling and dealing endeavors going on, but I don't know that anybody is looking out for Afghan teenagers and saying, how can we assure that you will have a livelihood so that you don't have to join some warlord's outfit? And much less looking out for Afghan infants. I mean, they're not even looking out for U.S. infants when you think about Flint, Michigan, or you think about, future generations in the United States and predictable water shortages and climate change is accelerating. So I think it's time that average, ordinary people say, well, I guess we do have to look out for our own interests. And it's not as though somehow we can engage in an armed struggle that's going to be meaningful or even vaguely relevant with the arsenal that our country has developed. I just did a walk 115 miles from Savannah, Georgia to Kings Bay, Georgia in support of 7 very devout Catholic workers who went into the Trident home port for Trident missiles in Kings Bay, Georgia. And, when you think just one of those Trident submarines carries the explosive power of 1,825 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, just 1,825. we can't deal with the United States in terms of weapon strength, but we do have people strength. We are many, they are few, that kind of an idea. So I wonder what could be coming around the corner.
Well, I hope you're right. As you know, I've long hoped that you are right about that. And, I often come back to when I was touring around with Greetings from Missile Street, which was the documentary video that I directed, which focused on Voice's work in Iraq, and of course, most of all, on the horrible situation there with U.S.-backed economic sanctions and no-fly zones and things like that. And I can remember on a few occasions, particularly at colleges and universities, where I would do a screening, and quite often there would be at least one student who would raise their hand, usually toward the end of the discussion and after the film had been shown. And their question would be, do you think it has to get worse before it's going to get better? Or do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better? And although it made me feel pretty grim, I had to admit that, I could certainly understand why that question would be asked and should be discussed. And it really goes to, what can we do? Are we willing to take certain risks in order to try to wage peace and social justice? And for those who are in that place, for those who have thought a lot about these issues and they are willing and ready to do those things, I thank those people and admire that. But not everyone is in the same place in terms of their ability, or at least maybe willingness to take those sorts of risks. So for people out there who are hearing you speak about Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq, who feel that they really want to do something, they recognize the truth of what you're saying, and they are genuinely deeply concerned, but they're not sure what to do. I'm sure you get this question all the time. What do you suggest that people who maybe aren't quite at that, get out of the streets place, what can they do?
My general suggestion is something that people, it turns out, are already doing quite often, but I generally say, go and find the seediest neighborhood in your area, whether it's a city or a small town. Grow familiar with the streets of that area, and you'll probably find some group that is organizing itself to help make a pantry available, or maybe it's a soup kitchen meal, or maybe it's a grassroots shelter, but figure out who those people are, and then among those people find kindred spirits. Now, it might mean rolling up your sleeves and cutting onions, or saying, okay, I'll take a night at the shelter, but get in with that group, because I think those will tend to be some of the most reliable analysts of your local situation. And then it will often tend to be the case that one's social life gets more involved in connections with people you never thought you'd be connected with necessarily before. It might be some people who are living on the streets. It might be some people who fell through the cracks. It might be, veterans of various wars. It might be people who just say, I wanted to try and make some kind of a difference, and this is what I can do. And then eventually communities begin to grow, and study groups form, and people begin to, maybe subscribe to some newspaper that they didn't subscribe to before. I learn a lot from the Catholic Worker every month that comes out of New York, and other various papers out of Los Angeles. And this is what I think social media sometimes can be quite helpful. People watch movies together, and then I think people get to a point where they think, well, maybe we could kind of start taking more leadership in these issues, or figuring out how to involve other people, or, maybe sponsor a young person to go and do something they dreamed of doing, but they couldn't do because they didn't have enough. And these things happen. But it's very, very disappointing, I think, if you become sort of mesmerized and just watch night after night. I mean, I have to say, the few times I've seen Rachel Maddow, I mean, she is a bundle of energy, and you can watch her every night and feel like you've really done something.
Right.
But truthfully, and you can watch Amy Goodman every morning and feel like you've done something. But actually, until you do something, a little bit more than clickativism, taking stock, but when you have kindred spirits coming together, meeting together, then I think more happens. And then I think I do have a couple of old adages. If you spread the peanut butter too thin, the bread rips. You can't do everything. So focus. Get to know a lot about one particular issue, and it'll be amazing how much insight is shed on other issues. I think that's pretty reliable. And then I do think this is relevant to say clearly there's an artificial shortage of love in our world. It's artificial. It's been created. It's not natural. It's not mandated by some divinity. It's something we create. We do it every century. It's being done. You can't love this person because this person's the wrong religion, or this person's the wrong color, or this person's the wrong gender, or somebody loved this person before, or this person committed there's so much lovelessness and loneliness that gets enforced as a consequence. So we've got enough rules in our world. No need to take these kind of unwritten rules about who can be loved and who can't be loved, and who can love and who can't love. Just ditch all that. I think that's a plausible way to find more happiness in life. And we have to be happy in life, or, how will we ever beckon others to say, hey, try this?
It's an important thing to consider in this time when, as I'm sure you know from all of your various activities and connecting with people across the country and around the world, there's a lot of despair and a lot of feelings of hopelessness out there right now.
Well, I listened to a fellow named Miguel de la Torres last weekend, and he wrote a book called Embracing Hopelessness. And he doesn't want people to sort of compulsively almost inject a saccharine or a false note of hope. That really makes him mad. And it was good for me to look in the mirror there, and not to be, trying to say, oh, well, tell this story and that might make people hopeful. Maybe hopelessness and despair aren't so, let's see, certainly you don't want to push anybody into hopelessness and despair. But imagine if a mother has her child in her arms and she's feeling desperate. She's not going to give up. That desperation is what's going to drive her to, cross a desert with the child in her arms to find food, or go into one of Saddam's hospitals because she's so desperate that maybe there will be a solution to reach out. So in despair, it might be that that will be part of the change factor. And yet I think of, what it has meant when we've listened to people who know that the hospital ward is a death row for their infants. And I don't want to say, oh, let's create that. But I do have to hear Miguel de la Torres when he says, Eurocentric helpers might not necessarily be helping us when they come in trying to rescue or trying to save. And I think younger generations they're very, very savvy to these ideas. And their task is going to be to create their discussions in the context of preparation for the end of the world. And that's what they're facing with our nuclear arsenals and our permanent warfare state. And I do wonder, are we equipping people with that recognition? I don't know. I'm in and out of high school and college classes every now and then. High schools actually more often than colleges, and I'm very encouraged by what I see in the high schools. Very encouraged. But I just don't know if people are being equipped with an awareness of how serious the situation is that they face, in which the discussions about identity politics are taking place.
You know, something that you're saying is reminding me of, I've considered a number of times, you know, why is it that we have the sort of maybe addiction to collectivism, and with some people who are, you know, seem genuinely liberal or even progressive, but there also is that sort of sense of, you know, if we just watch this one more documentary, or if we just read this one more book and have a book group about it, you know, then that's going to put us over the edge somehow, and that just isn't really reality when it comes to this kind of stuff. When I was in Afghanistan in 2004 with Megan Bartlett from Ground Zero for Peace, we talked with a woman who had lost many of her family members, not all of them, but several of them, in the 2001 U.S. bombings of Afghanistan. And I mean, there was a lot about what she said and described related to that day and her life since then that has stayed with me. But this one phrase in particular, more than all of the others, at one point she said, "I cannot afford the luxury of hopelessness."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes to kind of what you were just talking about. You know, someone in a place like Afghanistan who has almost nothing in terms of, you know, possessions, money, things like that, things that they might be afraid to lose. You know, her family, her surviving family, obviously, she doesn't want to lose them. But you know, that phrase really jumped out and struck me. And I think here in the States, so many people have so many things that they don't want to lose, and that brings us back to the risk factor. You know, they do care about issues, but there are so many things that they don't want to lose, so that they're not really willing to take the level of risk that might be required to try to affect change. I don't know. Am I rambling madly as usual, or?
No, actually, you know, the other concept, I suppose, that I think is necessary to consider is to what extent religions in our society, traditional religions, are kind of a smokescreen that cover up the real religion. And if you and I had had this conversation 10 years ago, I think I would have said very confidently, oh, the national religion is shopping. You know, people want to have those things. They want to have all these gadgets and things that the prophets on the television told them they have to be happy, and their kids said, you got to get this. And, you know, it just was like a religion almost. Your salvation is tied up with having stuff.
Yeah.
But now I think, as you say, people have things. They may be very, very anxious about whether or not their children will have the lifestyle a middle class in this country, you know, baby boomers, for instance, have been accustomed to. Not everybody, but many of the people who make up a lot of the public opinion, if you will, that gets expressed in voting and in some types of consumption of media. I think now it's, well, how do we save all this? Well, the new religion is militarism and militarization. And it's just amazing how it filters out into the society. You can get camouflaged baby diapers now. You go to the airport and, you know, they always make sure they say the military gets on first. I don't think anybody really looks to see, but that's getting embedded in our minds. I don't go to sporting events, but I hear that now even like at Franciscan colleges, armed soldiers are rappelling down from the rafters onto the gym floor before the basketball game. And it's very pervasive for us to have this idea that you really couldn't possibly get by without the United States military to protect you. Now, I think the truth is it jeopardizes us, and it's one of the most environmentally dangerous groups in terms of overconsumption of fossil fuels and creation of waste. And, you know, the military goes into these places and we end up becoming viewed as a menace and a frightening group. And, you know, 22 veterans of combat per day in the United States take their own lives. People come back often, you know, threatened and jeopardized and ruined from these wars. But it doesn't stop the machine. You know, after the Vietnam War, I was part of a generation that could not imagine that the United States would ever say, oh, well, that's over, let's do it again. You know, that war was over and out. But the military planners just went right to work figuring out, you know, how can the boys in the back room get over Vietnam syndrome and devise other kinds of wars. And now here we have a perpetual warfare state. 7 wars can be going on at once. And, you know, people still have the idea that the military will save us from some unenumerated threat or danger. We have to be sure that there's a danger out there. It might be North Korea, it might be China, it might be Iran. And meanwhile, or you know, new immigrants coming in. But then when we look at our economy and what really is driving the economy, we're increasingly becoming indebted to, and in a sense subservient to, others who haven't placed that huge emphasis on the military or are just starting to do that. And you know, it's a very bad road to hoe. But I think that many people who watch mainstream news and are inundated with sports and entertainment don't really get a chance to think about the extent to which militarism and militarization are affecting their lives. But it's getting into the education systems very consistently, so that, you know, if you were even just to look in your own area, you know, how many schools have teenagers being trained to shoot at pop-up targets? And, you know, how many schools are equipping their teenagers to be killers as part of their curriculum? You know, you study chemistry and you study English and then you study killing. This is a dangerous, dangerous development. And it isn't just under the Trump years. This has been growing. But of course, now we can't imagine things getting worse than what President Trump has promulgated on a number of fronts, because he's erratic and he's undereducated.
Among other things. So before we wrap up, I know that another place where there has been a lot of suffering and warfare and strife and so on, another place where you and I have both gone to at separate times, is Gaza. Mm-hmm. And I know that to the extent that it's possible for you to keep up with things there and people who you've met there, can you tell us, you know, what's the latest that you've heard there? Because my understanding is that it's just as much of a sort of prison as it has been for several years now.
And generation after generation growing up in this prison, and now without needed electricity, without education. It's a struggle always to keep education going, to keep after school programs going. I marvel at how people manage to survive and keep their communities going, but it's exceedingly difficult. And so there was the effort to go right up to the border and set up tents and hold your weddings and hold your family reunions and hold these gatherings and dress the kids up in Disney costumes and be colorful and do the Debka. And that happened. And I think we have to have great respect for that. Now, at the same time, there were others who were throwing kites that had tails that were afire and maybe starting fires on the other side that weren't in any way burning down or threatening lives across the border. And you know, those border divisions, it's just so hard for people in the United States to understand what it has meant for D9 bulldozers manufactured by Caterpillar in Peoria, possibly, to cross over that border and knock down row after row after row of orange grove trees and do it under clouds of white phosphorus. It's so hard for people to understand what it means for fishermen to go out into the ocean just to catch their fish, and then cannons of water are being fired at their boats, or they're kind of trying to keep the boat afloat and knowing that they can't keep doing this. They're outnumbered, they're outspent, they're outmaneuvered. And then to be in Gaza, the last time I was there following a bombing, it was the Operation Pillar of Defense, they called it. And, to be with a family whose child had been decapitated. And in 2009, I was there during what they called Operation Cast Lead, and a bomb exploded once every 11 minutes. And I don't know anything about ballistics, but pretty soon I knew, that was a 500-pound bomb dropped by most likely an F-13. Well, that was an Apache helicopter that fired a Hellfire missile. And how did I know it? Because the kids told it to me. And I met a doctor in the Al-Shifa Hospital emergency room, and it turned out he was from the neighborhood next to Uptown, the Lakeview neighborhood. So how did you get? Well, he was a Palestinian who went to med school in the United States and went over to work, and I think it was Doha, and came as a volunteer. And so I asked him, what do you want me to tell people back in your neighborhood? I'm going back to the United States pretty soon. And he started in on the effect of dense inert metal explosives lacerating limbs. He was an orthopedic surgeon, and he talked about how, if they're trying to do a surgery and somebody's got white phosphorus that's gone subcutaneous, as soon as it's exposed to oxygen, it starts to burn again. It's torturing the patient, and the doctors are inhaling the fumes, and they're standing ankle deep in blood. And then he said, no. He said, I'm completely wrong. Just you go back and tell people in my neighborhood that United States taxpayers paid for these weapons. And we both knew that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
But that's, you reap what you sow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, back in the beginning of the interview, when you were talking about Saudi and what seems to be compelling them to be blasting away in Yemen, that's it appears to be, at least in large part, a land grab.
Well, there's also the teaching moment, which we knew with regard to Iraq, and we see it in Gaza, and I think also in Yemen. I think the teaching message by bullying and threatening and menacing governments is, if you think you can stand up to us and frustrate our willfulness to take over resources and make profits and grab land, if you think you can stand up to us, could you take a look at Iraq? Could you take a look at Gaza? Could you take a look at Yemen? Yeah. And that message is not lost on other countries all around the world.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah. I was just going to say, I think that the impressions that I came away with from having been in Gaza for 6 weeks in late 2009 into early 2010, and having been in the West Bank and Israel a few times, around then and before that, is that, the real bottom line there is that Israel it's kind of like a colonialist in the sense of it's taking over there. And this time, rather than Western Europeans coming to this place that we now call the United States of America, and killing off and pushing out the people who were living here when we arrived, or when our ancestors arrived, now we have predominantly, I think, still Eastern Europeans going to this place that they're now calling Israel, and doing a pretty similar thing to the people who were living there at the time and are still living there, and still being, the thing that I kept hearing from people in Gaza was not this whole thing of, throw Israel into the sea, or kill all Israelis or anything like that. They were saying things like, end the embargo, end the occupation, and stop stealing our land.
Mhm, mhm.
Those were the three big things. I don't think those are unreasonable requests.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so much to learn from the ways in which people have stayed strong. And I think the BDS campaign is very important. Personally, boycott and divestment, I'm all for it. Sanctions, I can't cherry pick and say, well, in this case, sanctions are okay. I'm just going to back off of the word sanctions and say that we can concentrate very, very much on boycott and divestment. Uh, and that's had some exemplary success all around the world. I also admire the Gaza flotilla, that effort to sail in, and the flotilla was a good effort as well. And these are, very much grassroots community efforts that should continue. You know, that sense of making an example and punishing so badly that you'll create deterrence, it doesn't really work all that well. You see the Gaza flotilla coming back again and again. And I think of my 7 friends who are facing trial and will probably, if they're convicted, be slammed pretty badly with long prison sentences. But their courage, their willingness to say, we acted in accord with our deepest beliefs when we went into that Trident facility that was preparing for the end of the world. Well, the Trump group was very, very happy to pass the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was designed to say, yeah, you can set Christmas trees up in your big federal building plaza and nobody can stop you, and you can have Christian symbols at your football games and they didn't really count on 7 Catholic workers who devoted their lives to caring for neighbors and trying to stand up for justice be in prison saying, we were acting according to our religious freedom. And so the trial has been delayed. We thought it would be over by now. That's why we were walking through Georgia in the hottest weather during hurricane season. We thought, that we have to get this in before the trial. The trial is delayed because the magistrates are kind of shaking their head thinking, well, how do we deal with this? It's not like we can just throw it out. This is the latest Trump plum. And so that's a good kind of moral jujitsu in a sense, wherein how do they figure this one out? And so I think we shouldn't let the possible, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, but we shouldn't let possible strategies of deterrence deter us, because the alternative, homicide, an end of the world, or bludgeoning an already impoverished group of people, the alternative is so impossible to accept. So if it means we reorient our lives and find that community and find another way forward, that's all gift, really.
It's always an amazing experience to talk with you, listen to you. Inspiring, informative, and I could go on, for hours. But
well, it's a bit funny because it's like reruns of Greetings from Missile Street.
yeah, a little bit.
We sort of did this before, didn't we?
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, it kind of keeps.
Oh no, I don't mean to say unfortunately. Yeah. I think it's
well, no, not unfortunately in terms of you and I having a conversation. Unfortunately, things just don't seem to change very much in terms of U.S. Foreign policy and things like that.
Yeah, you plant the seeds, but we have no idea if there's going to be a harvest. But I don't know, there may be some residual teaching that carries forth. We really have to try to make things easier for the next generation.
Well, Kathy Kelly, thank you so much for your time and for being here on The Great Divide today. And of course, the Great Divide is primarily about the right-wing media's effect on what I see as becoming a big or an increasing divide between the populace of people in the United States. But these different issues that we've been talking about today, I think, have always been um, issues that have largely been kept out of all of the public's eye.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I think it has a lot to do with, maybe lessons that the military-industrial complex learned from showing too much in the media during the Vietnam War. So how do you address that? You buy up the media,
Mm-hmm.
and don't allow things that are going to upset the citizenry to be reported in the media. Hence, the George W. Bush administration saying we're not showing any, or we're not going to allow any photographs or video of soldiers, dead soldiers being brought home from Iraq.
Mm-hmm. And going to a climate change conference in Rio and saying the American way of life is a non-negotiable.
Right, yeah.
So we have to say we'll negotiate.
All these things that that don't really get into the public eye for, and it's not an accident. But I'm very, very grateful for people like you who have given your life to going to many of these places and bringing back the stories of people from these places, in hopes that, speaking of hope, in hopes that people here will hear those stories and react in a loving way to bring it back to the concept of love.
Well, thanks, Tom. Good
All
luck
right.
with this project.
Thank you so much, and we'll hopefully talk to you again soon.
Good, thanks.